learn that song?
I don't think I remember.
It's the song from the music box, isn't it? Isn't it?
You would be his niece. Your name, child?
Sarah?
I am Matthew Hopkins, witchfinder.
While scholars widely acknowledge that curious categorical copse, known collectively as folk horror, has historical roots twisting back to the late 19th century and earlier still, its contemporary form is perhaps best understood as a product of the British counterculture movement of the 1960s. Writing in his influential book, Folk Horror, Hours Dreadful and Things Strange, Adam Scoville suggests that the collective psychic climate that allowed for the genre's emergence can be attributed to, at least in some part, the counterculture's intermingling of new personal freedoms such as drug culture, activism, and sexual revolution, with old ideas of folk music, folklore, astrology, and Wicca magic. Indeed, the three foundational films of the genre, Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man, all of which surfaced in the latter part of the 1960s and early 1970s, uniformly express allegorical curiosity with and anxiety of the counterculture.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Howie. I trust the sight of the young people refreshes you.
No, sir. It does not refresh me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yet to forgo a cursory glance at the genre's 18th century heritage is to miss a salient point particularly relevant to this work, which is that while folk horror may delight in conjuring antiquarian spectres, practices and objects from a nation's past to terrorise contemporary audiences, in its emergence the genre also implies a deep-seated anxiety with modernity.
The lonely places our technocrats choose for their obscene experiments. Los Alamos, for instance.
Ah, yes.
Birthplace of the atomic bomb.
The ancient Indians had venerated that for centuries as sacred ground.
Yeah, again and again. Everywhere you'll find these sick laboratories built on or beneath such haunted sites. As though thereby to bottle the primal genie of the earth and to pervert him.
In the Romanticism movement spanning the late 1700s to mid-1800s, we can identify embryonic characteristics which would later gestate into folk horror. An emphasis on animals and nature, as is portrayed in the works of William Wordsworth.
Sea, hill and wood, this populous village, sea and hill and wood, with all the numberless goings-on of life, inaudible as dreams.
And the supernatural, as is depicted in the esoteric paintings of Henry Fuseli, such as The Nightmare, 1781, in which a demonic incubus crouches upon a sleeping woman's chest, or The Night Hag Visiting Lapland Witches, 1799, depicting a gathering of witches engaged in dark sacrificial ritual. The comparison stretches beyond the mere sharing of a narrative and symbolic framework, as Romanticism, like the counterculture of the 60s, embodied a skepticism towards the era that gave rise to it, and in particular the excesses of industrialisation. As Faber states, what we find most prominent in the first two generations of Romantics is a disdain for capitalist practices and commercialism in general, for the doctrine of utilitarianism, which seemed to underlie them, and for urbanisation. It is in the deployment of the pastoral and the otherly pastoral, the folkloric and the folk horrific, as a means of challenging prevailing ideology where this work finds some purpose. Since the release of Robert Eggers' 2015 film The Witch, there has been a rise in folk horror productions, accompanied by the propagation of documentaries, books and articles eager to declare the return to cultural significance of the subgenre. Yet while this work explores the narrative and aesthetic aspects of the films discussed, it primarily seeks to illuminate how the usage of motion picture film format enhances and parallels the primary concerns of what has been coined the folk horror revival.
England, what have you become? What has happened to your daughters and sons?
Released in 2018, Dean Puckett's The Sermon, captured on 35mm film, depicts a remote religious community in the English countryside where a charismatic hate preacher prepares to address his flock, blissfully unaware that the seeds of his undoing are being sown by his own daughter. While The Sermon, with its depiction of an isolated religious community, gang agley, and themes of repressed sexuality, willfully invite comparison with folk horror originators The Blood on Satan's Claw and The Wicker Man. To this writer's mind, the work shares aesthetic elements and thematic concerns with the folk-adjacent curio penned as Fen, written by David Rudkin and directed by Alan Clark. Both feature protagonists whose sexuality demarcate them as other within the rural communities they inhabit. Like Penda's Fen, The Sermon opens with its protagonist delivering a monologue addressed to England over picturesque images of the countryside before cutting to its central character staring out of a window, as if in contemplation of the land and its symbolic significance within the realms of identity, politics and mythos. Yet despite the adherence to established genre convention and the presence of aesthetic echoes, The Sermon moves beyond pastiche and homage, striking the viewer as an entirely authentic work. The methodology by which we might proclaim the authenticity of a work is, as linguist Theo van Leeuwen emphasises in his 2001 article, "What is authenticity? Fraught with ambiguity." Authenticity might seem a relatively straightforward concept, yet looking more closely, contradictions and problems emerge, stemming from the fact that it is ultimately an evaluative concept, however methodical and value-free many of the methods for establishing it may be. Yet Leeuwen continues by outlining common means by which authenticity is often attributed to a work, amongst them when the work resonates with a deeply held sentiment within its creator, page 393. In this regard, The Sermon, which features a proto-progressive protagonist overthrowing a retrogressive collective depicted as cruel and spiteful, is seemingly in keeping with writer-director Dean Puckett's own progressive ideology. Speaking of The Sermon's conception to website Director's Notes, the director stated, "When Brexit happened and Donald Trump happened, it suddenly felt like a large percentage of the population of their respective countries were looking backward to a time when the UK and the US were great, but these great times were not so brilliant if you weren't a heterosexual white male." In this context, the film can be viewed as a genuine manifestation of the anxieties and frustrations experienced by its creator amidst political upset. Puckett imbues the modern folk horror with a contemporary and sincere essence, thereby engendering innovation within the genre. Indeed, the extent to which the ideological needle has moved in the intervening years between inception and revival is illustrated by The Sermon's antagonistic church congregation, which bears greater resemblance to the Denzians of Sergeant Howie's local parish than the inhabitants of Summerale or Angel Blake's sect. Another manner by which the film courts authenticity is in the use of 35mm film stock. Speaking to Falmouth University students in 2020, Puckett explained, "I was very clear I wanted to shoot the film on 35mm because all those films I'm referencing, Blood on Satan's Claw, The Wicker Man, were shot on 35mm and I wanted it to be almost like you could play it alongside them and it would fit." The convergence of aura and analog film format, whereby the motion picture camera is represented as a threshold to authenticity, signifies a contemporary recharacterization of traditional mechanical apparatus. Writing in her 2018 essay, The Ambivalence of Authenticity, Erica Balsam takes the opportunity to remind us that film is of the first machine age, it is forever tied to the destruction of nature, colonial projects, and the domination of life proper to industrial modernity. Indeed, the considerable anxiety that surrounded the fledgling medium is perhaps best captured in Walter Benjamin's seminal 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, in which Benjamin, while noting film's potential, states that the mass-produced media represented a risk to art's innate aura through reproduction, accessibility, loss of distance, and technological mediation. Within a cultural context, it is intriguingly pluralistic to witness the evolution of film, from its initial perception as a threat to authenticity, to its current cultural status as a vessel of authenticity. This shift in interpretation is attributed to the current anxieties surrounding the emergence of digital technology, a fear which echoes those once associated with mechanical reproduction. As Balsam further stated, in the late 19th century, authenticity became a major preoccupation precisely because it was deemed to be under threat. Similarly, it has recently re-emerged as a force in contemporary culture where it is perceived as a way of escaping the metonymy, automation, and even deceptiveness of digital experience. If we revisit Puckett's original comment, this time assuming that he merely meant that the sermon should aesthetically replicate these seminal works in folk horror rather than aiming for authenticity, this does not imply that in striving for the former he did not achieve the latter, as such evaluations are made not only by filmmakers but also by audiences. Reflecting on his experience with the sermon at film festivals, Puckett observed that the deployment of 35mm had a discernible impact on attendees and their perception of the film. Regarding that effect, he said, "It elevated it in terms of the way it was viewed at film festivals. It gave it something extra, it made it a little bit more special so that people paid more attention to it. But that took a lot of effort and it took a lot of planning, and it was about having to be very meticulous about the shots." Perhaps it is not too far-fetched to suggest that for an audience attending an independent film festival, possessing a fundamental grasp of filmmaking process, the heightened risk, expense and effort involved in capturing the story in 35mm may have contributed to the designation of the work as special or indeed authentic. In this regard, we might query whether the resurgent appeal of film and its subsequent demarcation as authentic is a form of fetishism, and as such an example of what Canadian author Andrew Porter terms conspicuous authenticity, 2010. Drawing upon economist Thurston Veblen's concept of conspicuous consumption, 1899, in which one's social status and wealth is displayed through the purchase of extravagant goods, Porter suggests that the quest for the authentic is also vulnerable to such a charge, noting that authenticity is a positional good which is valuable precisely because not everyone can have it. In this way, we may understand the appeal of motion picture film to filmmaker and audience member alike as a status symbol, a method by which to signify exclusivity, both in production and in consumption. In a genre deeply entwined with visions of pasts both real and imagined, it is pertinent to consider the role nostalgia plays in the resurgence of folk horror. In recent years, a burgeoning interest has emerged around what writer Bob Fisher aptly branded the Haunted Generation, 2017, a term used to signify those born between 1965 and 1980, whose childhoods were, as Fisher and others contend, saturated with the sights and sounds of the eerie, uncanny and macabre. Televisual icons of this era, such as the whimsically haunting Bagpuss, Doctor Who with its makeshift carnival of science fiction grotesques, and the Central Office of Information's memorably unsettling public information films, collectively testify to this haunting legacy. The longing for and haunting by this unusual period might go some way towards explaining folk horror's miraculous resurrection, at least within a British context. The powerful nostalgia for the period acts as a temporal gateway, allowing past aesthetics and forms to encroach on the current day, a phenomenon writer Mark Fisher termed hauntology, 2014. Drawing upon the work of Jacques Derrida's 1994 book The Spectres of Marx, in which the philosopher inferred that the spectre of communism continues to haunt the Occident long after the economic system's failure, Fisher extended the hauntological concept to include the cultural realm, implying that the artifacts of the past, music, film and television, had the capacity to haunt and inform the media of the present. Writing in his 2023 essay, Yesterday's Memories Tomorrow, Nostalgia, Hauntology and Folk Horror, graphic artist and writer Andy Pachorik notes that this phenomenon manifests sonically in music and soundscapes, drawing inspiration from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. and visually in the use of faded colours, mathematical shapes and duotone imagery, reminiscent of archaic reference books of the period. This suggests that the haunted generation is drawn to a distinct grammar and aesthetic rooted in the past, and by focusing on such aesthetic elements, we can consequently view the analog film camera's usage in such works not only as a conduit to authenticity, but also as a portal to bygone eras. The Worm of Bulk Pimbaras, a Welsh language short film shot in 16mm, offers an example of how the technical aspects of filmmaking have become entwined with the genre conventions of the modern folk horror. Depicting the journey of three men tasked with performing a harrowing ritual, the film diverges from many of the narrative and visual conventions of folk horror. Stone monoliths etched with cryptic symbols give way to mobile phones. Ritualistic attire is exchanged for everyday outdoor clothing. And throughout much of the film's duration, the mystical landscape competes for attention with the mundane elements of modernity, such as double-glazed windows and a new model Range Rover. Further still, the characters in the story bear little resemblance to their canonical forebearers and could seamlessly inhabit other genres such as British crime or straight drama. Speaking to Warp Perspective, writer-director Craig Williams said of the unusual blend, "I wanted to channel the spirit of that era, the 70s, in a modern genre film by juxtaposing Hammer-style credits, familiar folk horror reference points, and an arcane-sounding title with a more grounded, quotidian vision of the present day in rural Wales." From Williams' words, we can begin to appreciate the role incidental or supposedly invisible technical aspects and practices of production play in invoking a sense of the past and lineage within genre. The Hammer Studios inspired title card, designed by Richard Wells, is one way in which this is achieved, but could the material basis of the film strip be another? When I spoke to producer Julian Allen, he acknowledged Williams' fondness for 70s film and eagerness to utilise the 16mm format, yet insisted that the challenges and expense around shooting with film meant that the decision was not driven by personal peccadillos, but rather due to the medium's seemingly intrinsic connection to the picture they were producing. Allen stated, "This particular story and what we were going for needed to be shot on film." Dominique Schrey's 2019 article, Analogue Nostalgia and the Aesthetics of Digital Remediation, sheds light on the role of the technical medium in generating nostalgia. Schrey argues that the medium's capacity to evoke nostalgia and tap into cultural memory surpasses the mere representations it portrays. Media themselves can become an object of nostalgia. The sentiment can be directed towards their specific medial constitution, their materiality, the aesthetics resulting from these factors, or all of these combined. Our cultural memories are shaped not just by the production qualities of an era, but by the subtle properties of the recording media themselves. At the heart of folk horror lies the enduring presence of ancient magic, quietly preserved within rural communities largely forgotten by the modern world. This theme permeates the genre, manifesting through rituals, incantations, sacred texts, and talisman. Even in this distant context, we discover a harmony between the thematic concerns of the genre and the resurgence of the motion picture film. In his text, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Benjamin underscores the initial purpose of art as a utilitarian magical artifact. He asserts, the contextual integration of art in tradition found its expression in the cult. We know that the earliest artworks originated in the service of a ritual, first the magical, then the religious kind. Psychologist Eugene Subotsky, formerly of the University of Lancaster, similarly notes the supernatural properties of art in his 2018 book, Science and Magic in the Modern World, in which he describes the paintings of Chirico and Marguerite as ambassadors of an alien world. These paintings immerse one in that world, which in one sense resembles our everyday world, and in another sense is fundamentally different from it. Subotsky perceives these artworks as akin to Enochian keys, possessing the ability to unlock knowledge of alternative realms, and to tap into the reservoir of magical thinking that resides within the subconscious mind. Drawing on Hollis Frampton's notion that no activity can become an art until its proper epoch has ended and it has dwindled as an aid of survival into total obsolescence, Erica Balsam notes that the analog camera has undergone a transformation from the industrial to the artisanal. By interlinking these theoretical concepts, one could suggest that as the motion picture film diminishes in functionality as a means of large-scale industrial storytelling, and knowledge of its usage becomes obscured by time and scarcity, it drifts towards the artisanal and primitive, and in doing so accumulates the aura of a magical tool. From the inception of cinema, an inherent and symbiotic relationship has existed between the magical and cinematic realms. The antecedent to cinema, the Magic Lantern Show, served as a precursor to cinematic experiences and was frequently employed to stage phantasmagoria, captivating audiences with supernatural spectacles. Pioneering filmmakers, notably exemplified by George Méliès, transcended conventional roles, embodying both filmmakers and illusionists. That said, it is arguable that over the passage of time, the magic inherent in the cinematic experience has waned. It is in this context that the work of Mark Jenkin becomes salient. The Cornish-born writer-director of BAFTA-winning Bait and the experimental Ennis Men is pivotal within the discussion of folk horror and the analogue. Jenkins' favouring of a hand-cranked Bolex H16 combined with his comprehensive involvement in all aspects of production remove his work from the industrial into the artisan and towards the esoteric. Jenkins' Ennis Men, in which a wildlife volunteer living on an island on the Cornish coast, documenting our observations of a wildflower, contains much of the iconography of the folk horror, such as a standing stone, ghostly apparitions, and period costuming. Yet it is in Jenkins' artisan approach, combined with the utilisation of a filmmaking process for which much of the knowledge is slipping or has slipped from the popular zeitgeist, which permeates his work with an appealing sense of esoteric allure. In his book The Magician, His Training and Work, 1959, noted occultist W.E. Butler describes the art of conjuring, or evoking to visible appearance, 26, as the most spectacular form of magic. The photochemical process and handicraft aspects of Jenkins' work are the spectacular spectacle, the invisible but detectable presence of a hand when zooming or pulling focus, the dubbed audio, the intentional underexposure of the film to amplify its materiality, all serve to heighten the sense of temporal slippage, awareness of the production, and the magic of the invisible being made visible. Both the disciples of folk horror and the artisan community gathering around the analogue image share similar concerns. They are searching for authenticity, they are haunted by pasts and futures real and imagined, and compelled by a romantic sense of the magical. In each area we have considered, we have found paradox. The authentic is fetishistic, the nostalgic serves to remind us of what has been lost, and the magical moves in the mechanical.